field level hazard assessments don't look anything like what you'd see on a construction site, because we can't go to someone and say, please stop beating on that person while we fill out our JHA before we arrest you.
Nicole Wetsch, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thrilled to have you here. You're currently the manager of Occupational Health and Safety for the Edmonton Police Service, but your background is incredibly interesting in biology. I found that there really is no one way that people end up in the safety space. No. It's quite common that they start someplace and then they end up there. So I think it would be probably best to just have you start off by giving us a rundown of your background and how you got to where you are today.
I started my career working in research labs. I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do coming out of high school, other than I liked science. So I went to U of A, did a degree with a major in bio and a minor in chem and physics, because really had no clue where I wanted to end up. And managed to get a lab working under a very, very brilliant researcher named Diane Taylor at the University of Alberta. And she did research into medical microbiology research. So she essentially studied two types of bacteria, Helicobacter pylori, which is the causative agent of most ulcers, as well as Campylobacter jejuni, which is the most common cause of food poisoning, but you never hear about it because it doesn't tend to kill you the way E. coli and salmonella does. It just makes you wish you were dead. So I started off as a tech in her lab doing research and running the lab. And that's kind of where I got interested in health and safety. She ran a very tight ship and had an amazing lab that was run very, very well. But that wasn't necessarily true for everything that I saw during my time there and some of the other labs that we came across. So it kind of got me interested in health and safety. And so she was the one who actually suggested to me the Occupational Health and Safety program through the Faculty of Extension at the U of A, which was, I think at the time, probably one of the only OHS programs in the country. It was long before the diplomas and the degrees were available then. So I got interested in health and safety there and started doing my certificate program while I was still working in her lab. And eventually she retired and her lab shut down, and I went on maternity leave with my second child and was looking for a job to come back to, and found what was then known as the Nanotechnology Institute. So it was a collaboration between the federal government and the provincial government in the U of A. It's located on the University of Alberta campus. And they were looking for someone to take over health and safety for the institute itself. So looking at, creating hazard assessments and policies and programs and procedures for that specific research institute. And so I started that, and it was very cool, very eye-opening, a lot of exposure to a lot of different types of research, from bio to chemistry to microscopy, all nanotechnology, so on a very small scale, but it was a really good opportunity to have a lot of exposure to different types of hazards and different types of experiments and equipment, and a really eye-opening first introduction to health and safety. And after about 2 years there, because we fell under the National Research Council, there was a decision made to centralize all of the health and safety positions. So instead of reporting into the Institute, I started reporting to basically Ottawa. And that came with taking on responsibility for some other sites. So I was given the Astronomy Institute in Victoria, and the Radiological Institute in Penticton, and the Chemical Institute in Vancouver.
Wow.
Eventually I had the crop sciences in Saskatchewan as well. And just before I left, I was tasked with the Medical Research Institute in Winnipeg too. So it was very busy, very eye-opening, but really great because it was never the same day twice. It was a new problem or a new issue or a new thing to look at every day. So it was a very interesting place to work for sure. And then following that for a few years, I had the opportunity to make the jump to EPS, where it was going to be a lot less travel. My kids were still pretty young then, so it was a good fit to make good timing to make the change to more of a local position. And Oddly enough, dealing with police officers is very, very similar to dealing with researchers.
So, it's interesting that you bring up this diverse background that you have in a adjacent field, right? And that experience. How have you found, I guess, the tools and things you learned um, from your time in the lab beneficial in the health and safety space? What are some of those, I guess, that way of thinking that is beneficial in your day to day?
I think what was beneficial to me going to policing from research is both of those environments tend to not be as prescriptive as a lot of other health and safety environments. So, if you're working in construction, if you're working in manufacturing, there's an ISO standard you can go to for 99% of what you're doing. Oftentimes with research, that standard doesn't exist because what you're doing has never been done before. With policing, there might be a standard, but because of the emergent nature of the work, the standard often doesn't apply to you. So being able to kind of think out of the box and apply those concepts to both environments was really beneficial. So, like, one of the things early on in my career with EPS that was an emergent issue was fentanyl. And so EPS was one of the first organizations, policing organizations in the country to equip members with naloxone. And that was long before there was a directive from the province that allowed us to do so. So we actually had to work with pharmacists to have them prescribe naloxone to EPS so that we could give that to our drug and gang members and our clandestine lab members so that they could protect themselves. But when we started looking at our policies and our processes for that, we really went back to some of my research experience. So the control banding that we used for novel chemicals in nanotechnology and chemical research, we applied to fentanyl and carfentanil because at that time it was so new, we really didn't know the exposure risks to the same extent that we do now. So the policy processes are the same, the environment's different.
Interesting. And you bring up a good point there that the emergent nature of policing, because a lot of our audience listening might be in construction, oil and gas, manufacturing, these sort of typical
Yeah.
safety space. But there's a lot of unique challenges that come with policing. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of that space and that what it's like in day to day working in that?
Yeah, I think a lot of our challenges come from the members themselves, and our members are amazing, amazing people. Um, People who go into jobs like policing or firefighting or EMTs do that because they inherently want to keep people safe. But what I find with our members is as much as they are always thinking about how to keep other people safe, they're not as great at thinking about how to keep themselves safe. So they tend to be a very risk tolerant group. So one of the biggest challenges I think in at least the beginning part of my career here was getting them to think about themselves as opposed to just running in headfirst, worried about the people that they're trying to help. Certainly, that risk tolerance translates to other things that they do. So where in my research role, I was dealing with researchers that would spend weeks or months planning out everything that they did. Police don't have that luxury. So we have to really equip them with the proper equipment and the proper tools and the proper training so that they can make those split-second decisions and still maintain their safety and the safety of the people around them.
Right. So let's talk about making decisions in the moment because I think this is an important skill, especially, obviously policing you deal with more emergent
Yeah.
situations, like you said, but those kind of things can happen on any work site where there's a moment of, a high pressure situation or there's an immediate emergency. What are some strategies that you teach to really deal with those appropriately and well?
Um, a lot of a lot of our training, like our tactics training unit and our firearms training unit are amazing, amazing groups that it's that repetition of training the same things over and over and over again. So you take out that need for that decision factor as much as possible. They need to know their equipment, they need to know their processes, and they need to know their legislation, really what is within their scope to do without thinking about it. So our recruit training time period is really crucial. But beyond that, having repetitive training throughout their careers. So we have things called GDMs, which are essentially just training days, and they get 6 of those a year. And each of those days is going to be a totally different thing dedicated to something that is related to their work. Sometimes it's mental health and resiliency. Sometimes it's tactics. Sometimes it's firearms training. Sometimes it's their driver's training. But it's that repetition on a regular basis throughout the year, combined with things like online training. It's a 24-hour work environment, shift work. It's really difficult to get 3,000 police officers or 2,000 police officers into a physical room for in-person training. So having online training that is meaningful and useful and something that they can go to and do in their own time in between, writing reports or at the start or end of a shift is really important to reinforcing those messages, and making sure that they're equipped with what to do, what they need to do when the situation arises. And then combined with that, we do things like our parades at the beginning of shifts. So every squad's going to have a parade at the beginning of the shift when there's pertinent issues, things like fentanyl when that issue first arose, and we looked at things like issuing naloxone. We also, as part of our response to fentanyl, we equipped all of our cars with bag valve masks and trained our members on how to use a bag valve mask so that they're not using a respirator, a small mask where they're in close contact with someone. They're able to still give respiration, still provide first aid, but do it from a distance and able to protect themselves. So things like that are covered in GEDM and then reinforced through our online training and our parades and the messaging that goes out on a regular basis through our internal website and poster campaigns and TV slides and all of that to keep reinforcing those messages.
So what I'm kind of getting from this is that it's not just one form of training
No.
that you give out, right?
No, and it could never be with our officers. They have so much information that they're bombarded with on a regular basis. A one-time training is never going to be impactful because it's just going to be replaced in a month's time by the 1,500 other messages and training that they've gotten. So making sure that we're constantly reinforcing those messages is really important.
So have you found that is it the blended approach? So you said the online classroom portion.
Yeah.
Has that been particularly effective in making the message stick or making the learning
I
stick?
think it has to be a combination of all of them.
Okay.
Certainly, again, different learning styles. You're going to get someone who does their online training and that's going to stick and they're going to have it and they're going to go forward with it. You're going to have someone who does a half-hour online training and it's out of their head 60 seconds later. And it's true. It's just depending on how they learn. We do communication campaigns. We do, like I said, the parades. Our OHS group will produce quarterly topics. So whatever we think is a pertinent issue for the membership at that time goes out once a quarter to the senior leadership, and it's pushed down from senior leadership down to the squad level so that they can see not only is this important, but this is a message that's coming from your leadership. So your leadership deems this is important as well.
Right. And it's interesting because the police force, almost, I'd imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in this similar way to the military, there's different ranks. And
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
right. There's sort of a hierarchy to follow.
Absolutely.
How have you found being able to work in that environment effectively for safety to make sure that messages are getting across?
It was certainly eye-opening to me when I first started, because coming from a research environment where I'd go to, the director of the institute as easily as I would go to the tech in the lab, it was different for me on how I had to approach the messaging. Not to say that I can't speak with a deputy chief or the chief as easily as I can with a constable, but the way we deliver that message is different. So that was a bit of a learning curve, I think, for everybody, every civilian coming into EPS who's never worked in that kind of militaristic environment before. It's certainly a learning curve for us. But it also helps you reinforce the ideas that are really, really important, because it's one thing if the OHS consultant is telling you something, it's a completely different thing if your inspector or your superintendent or your deputy chief is coming to you with that message. And so in a lot of cases, that militaristic rank structure can actually be beneficial for messaging.
Interesting. So it took a little bit to get used to,
Yeah,
but once you had it, actually had clear benefits in terms of that
absolutely.
communication. When it comes to earning the buy-in of leadership for safety, so I'm thinking about in your space in particular, there's a bit of probably conflict between, I don't want to say conflict, but figuring out how to uh, set up safety programs that make
Yeah.
sense and safety protocols that make sense without jeopardizing the mission critical elements.
100%. And we really, we quite often hear it if someone comes into our environment and sees something like our hazard assessments. They look very different than the hazard assessment you would see if you went to, say, a construction site. Um, Field level hazard assessments don't look anything like what you'd see on a construction site, because we can't go to someone and say, please stop beating on that person while we fill out our JHA before we arrest you. Like, it's just not going to be functional. So a field level hazard assessment in the moment is never going to be something that exists for us. But for us, a field level hazard assessment looks at something like a mission plan. When we are going to be executing a warrant, they have some time and space to look at how they do that execution, what risks and hazards they might face, and what kind of resources they need to have in place to mitigate that. When we look at things like a laser control form, so when they're setting up laser enforcement on, Yellowhead Trail, they'll look at things like the visibility, the weather, the time of day, and all the factors that they have to take into account to be able to ensure that their people can do that job safely. So we certainly look at things much differently, but I think one of the benefits to working for a police organization is safety as a game. So we might have to do a little bit more work to make sure we're speaking the same language, because they don't necessarily always speak the same language as we speak. But once we get that message across, there's I don't think I've ever worked anywhere that's had more support for safety, just because that's the nature of their business. That's what they do. So once they understand the purpose and what needs to be done, it's it's a very, very supportive environment for safety.
Interesting. So almost in a way, when you're being reasonable with, the members of the force there, they also respect it. When you can understand their perspective
Yeah.
and the challenges that might come with that. Like you said, certain like maybe with the warrant you have some time, but with an emergent arrest or something you might have less time.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about how important it is for you to understand where they're coming from.
And it absolutely is true. And one of the things, when I first started, that my manager encouraged me to do, and what I've always done with my staff, is like, we all do ride-alongs. We'll go and do a ride-along with patrol. We've done ride-alongs with K9, with Air One, and we go and we'll spend a day at our property exhibit unit to see how they work, so that we have that understanding of the things that they're doing, because it's one thing to suggest a control measure to them when we've never seen them do their work. It's a totally different thing to spend that day with them and see day in and day out how they're doing their work, and suggesting control measures or policy changes that we are able to convey to them and make them understand why it's going to improve things for them.
Right. When it like over the time that you've been with the police force there, what are some of those measures that stick out to you in your mind that have made improvements that you've seen? Okay, this made a big difference.
I think so. Like, looking at the last, the fentanyl, the work we did with fentanyl, I think we've never had an exposure to fentanyl of a member ever. Um,
Really?
and no,
Wow.
and actually, fentanyl exposures for police officers is not actually a common thing. Um, but I think the importance and the focus that we placed on that when it was an emerging issue bought us a lot of credibility with the membership because they were able to see that we really cared about their safety. All of the work that we did looking at fentanyl was not about protecting the public. That's their job. Our job was to ensure that our members can go into those situations and they're protected. So being able to really focus a lot of our time and energy and resources on making sure that they were as safe as possible doing their jobs, I think gained us a lot of credibility with the organization. But in terms of being impactful, I would say two of the biggest things that are most impactful for their day-to-day work is we had a really, really keen officer in our training unit that worked with the local company on designing a better duty belt. And so, rather than having a 2-inch leather belt that is really standard for most policing organizations, he worked with them over a number of months on creating a padded duty belt. Um, and then reached out to our section and involved us. And so we worked with our facilities team and our innovation team to do a trial on these padded duty belts and be able to show that like there is a statistically significant improvement in officer wellness with these belts. So,
And sorry, what is a duty belt?
so the duty belt is the belt that the members wear that they have all their equipment on. So on any given day, an average police officer is carrying between 30 and 35 pounds of equipment
Oof.
around their waist. So as you can imagine, that can have a significant impact on their day-to-day health. So having a padded duty belt that can mitigate some of the potential injuries from carrying that amount of weight is really impactful to our membership. So through doing that pilot study, we were able to show that there was a benefit to having this duty this padded duty belt. So that was a small study with about 20 people, 25 people, something like that, which gave us the justification to expand that program to allow it for people with a medical need. So people with hip back injuries were able to access that belt for about 2 years. That allowed us to gather the data to show that it will be impactful for everyone. So we've now just recently been able to make that a piece of equipment that's available for the whole membership. So you don't have to already have an injury. You can get it as a preemptive measure. So I think that is one of the really most impactful things that we've been involved with. The other piece would be the transition from using just an internal soft body armor vest to having the external vest as an option. So our dress and deportment committee, which is the group that is responsible for both the look of the uniform, but also the equipment that members are able to use, was tasked with working with our Corps Sergeant Major, who is the ultimate person responsible for that thing, or for that committee and for those things. We worked with them to create a group, a resource group that included finance and facilities and materials management and health and safety, as well as dress and deportment, to look at doing a very fulsome RFP for these external vests. So having all those voices at the table let us design a purchasing or RFP process that allowed us to ensure that we had the best cross section of the organization. So it wasn't, we picked 6 members that were probably all 6'2" male and 220 pounds to trial this piece of equipment. We had about 25 participants, cross section of the organization, female, non-binary, males, with a breadth of experience, some with past injuries, some without past injuries, very wide breadth of shapes and sizes, so that when we trialed this equipment, we had a really fulsome view of what was going to be the best equipment for the membership. And everybody in this trial process trialed all 4 of the best that made it to the trial phase of the process, and then evaluated each of those best so that we knew when we finally awarded that contract, that equipment was going to be the best possible option for our membership.
Interesting. So this is something that isn't talked about a bunch, but PPE that fits
Yeah.
for everybody is something that I'd imagine, especially when you're carrying, like you said, 35 pounds on the belt and these heavy bulletproof vests, there's a lot of gear here. What are some of the impacts of of equipment and PPE that doesn't fit well?
Um, so one of the biggest concerns for us, obviously, when you're looking at a vest, is a gap in the vest actually impacts its ability to function. So they're designed to fit close to the body. So anytime you have a gap, it's going to actually lessen the ability to do what it's supposed to do. So you're increasing the likelihood of injury. So particularly, 20, 30 years ago, when every vest was built for that 6'2", 220 male, it put smaller statured people, it put larger statured people, but it also put female members at a significant disadvantage when it came to safety. So there's been a number of really significant improvements in that area over the last 20 years. And so having the ability to really seek out suppliers that are going to be able to offer a wide range of sizes, both in the vertical height of the vest, but also accommodating a woman's physique over a flat-chested male is really, really important. And so certainly something that you wouldn't have necessarily seen in police equipment 20 years ago is that ability for those service providers to have a much wider range of sizes, but also, like in the case of our contract, if our people don't fit their range of sizes, they have that ability to custom design and custom make something for them that is going to fit and accommodate their body shape. And that's going to improve their safety significantly. So that's a huge piece of it. The other thing that we're seeing now is as oddly enough, PPE for women has been a huge issue for a long time in a lot of industries. But what we're starting to see now, and I think it's not unique to policing, is that when people look at starting to design equipment for specifically for women, it actually benefits everyone. So some things that we're starting to see now are things like handcuffs that are significantly lighter than the handcuffs you would have had access to 15, 20 years ago. And yeah, that's a great improvement for our female members that are smaller stature and might have a harder time carrying 35 pounds around their waist. But it's also a significant improvement for male members that aren't going to be carrying as much weight as well. So consistently we see when manufacturers start really considering females in the design of their PPE, it tends to benefit the whole group.
Interesting. Okay, that's something that I wouldn't have thought of going into that. Was that kind of a surprise for you as well?
I don't know. As a woman, I think if you design for women, you tend to get a better product. But
Yeah.
but that's just my opinion. But
Yeah.
I think when you look at stuff like a vest, 20 years ago the length of the vests were very limited. Now you see a lot more options of a shorter vest, which benefits women, but it also benefits our smaller stature men as well. So I think when you start being more inclusive in your approach to designing these products, everyone wins.
Right. No, it makes 100% sense. And I'd imagine that, some of the feedback from the officers, have you heard that?
It's much more comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, so certainly, we definitely are seeing a benefit to the transition to the external vest for those that prefer it, as well as the padded duty belt. It's certainly an improvement for them in terms of their day-to-day use of the equipment and not feeling that weight and not feeling that heaviness that they're used to feeling, especially for some of our members that have been members for 15, 20 years and have been dealing with this for the bulk of their careers. Our newer members are a bit spoiled in that they're coming onto the job with some of those benefits already in place, so they won't necessarily know the pain the way their
Yeah.
predecessors did. But I think that's a good thing. If we can prevent them from having that pain ever to begin with, that's a win.
Right. And you know what? This applies to all industries as well. When you look at, um, you know, anywhere where there's PPE implemented, it's not just policing, but we really need to look at the design. How can we make it functional? There's always some way that you could be improving
Yeah.
that, and getting that process going. So it's incredibly important. Something that you also brought up was, the shift work nature of policing, how it can be up to 24-hour shifts, which is crazy.
24-hour shift cycle. They would
Oh,
work a
okay.
12-hour shift. Yeah.
Okay. Write that. Yeah, you got it out of there. Yeah. Okay. So with the long shifts, how do you go about making sure that um, police are still effective?
Yeah.
Or, with that lack of rest, obviously there can be some challenges. And the reason I'm asking this is because a lot of industries in,
Yeah.
construction, oil and gas, mining, they all deal with a version of this. So I think
Yeah.
it is crucial.
I think there's a really significant amount of research available on shift cycles and the impacts that it has on your sleep cycles and things like that. And certainly, when we design shift cycles, we look at ensuring that we're following all of that research. So your shifts should always be forward rotating. So you're never going to go from a morning shift back to a night shift. You're going to go morning shift to an afternoon shift, then to a night shift, and having an appropriate amount of days off in between those switch and shifts. So you're doing 4 days of a day shift and then you're switching to an afternoon shift. You're going to have an appropriate length of time off in between. You wouldn't go from a morning shift on Friday to an afternoon shift on a Saturday. That's just not part of the way our shift cycles would function. We do start right from recruit training in terms of bringing in a nutritionist that talks to them about proper nutrition and ensuring that they are fueling themselves properly. We do a lot of training on resiliency and sleep cycles and ensuring that you're protecting that right from the beginning. And certainly, like, partnering with programs that can improve those for members that have maybe been on the job 20 years and are now starting to see a negative impact of that. So we've just started a partnership with a company that specifically addresses sleep issues through psychological counseling. So, pardon me, they're one of our approved providers in terms of you can use your benefits to be able to access this programming that specifically looks at your sleep hygiene and improving that as someone who's working that 24-hour shift cycle where you're always rotating in the shifts that you work. Um, there is one of the amazing things for someone who's looking at a career in policing is you can really have, 15 different careers in one. So there's a number of different specialty areas that members can transition in and out of through the course of their career. So there's options there. If somebody is hitting a point where the shift cycles are getting to them and they're not bouncing back the way they have in the past, there's options at looking at applying to some of these other areas that might work a standardized day shift for a while, though it gives them that opportunity to transition out of a rotating shift environment for a while and do some recovery, but also learn some new skills, do a different kind of policing, like SRO unit or school resource officers is a great one. I know it's a really coveted one because they get to work with the kids every day, but it gives them also that 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, gives them a break from that shift cycle, and gives them a lot of community engagement skills. So certainly there's a number of different approaches that we look at. Our nurses and our nurse practitioners also will refer people to sleep studies and things like that to make sure that we're doing what we can to protect their sleep hygiene.
Wow. That's amazing to, I guess, have that foresight as an organization to see that this is, especially with sleep, it's not necessarily something that, you have one bad night's sleep. It's not going to ruin your life, but over a long period of time, what is the
Yeah.
impact here?
And certainly there's cumulative effects to poor sleep hygiene on health. That I know is something that is really important in policing and healthcare and other environments with those types of shift cycles. There's a lot of negative impacts to that poor sleep hygiene that can affect their overall health when it comes to things like cardiovascular health and diabetes and things like that. So certainly, when you look at populations of police officers and firefighters and things like that, places that work those 24-hour shift cycles, you do see an increase in some of those negative effects. So we as an organization have an obligation to do what we can to mitigate any of that.
Right. And you mentioned as well the benefits and the additional sort of ways that you're taking care of your members. How impactful do you see that being in the, day to day when they're used, obviously, the benefits and the programs that are made available?
I think from what I've seen, we have a fairly good uptake on a lot of those programs. Especially, I think with our younger members coming in, they are I will say, much more self-aware when it comes to maintaining that health. I think that's just part of the larger shift in the general population that um, the 20-year-olds tend to be much more aware of their health impacts than maybe our 50, 60-year-olds, just because of the information that's been available to them and what they've grown up with. So certainly, I think our newer members coming in tend to be better right at the get-go of making use of those and having a consistent approach to how they look after their health. But that being said, I think the more we've seen a lot of uptake from our older members as well. I think the more we talk about these things, the more we make it known, the more we have champions within the organization that are really vocal about talking about resiliency as a whole, whether it be their mental health or their physical health. Certainly that improves the uptake on the programs that we're offering.
It's interesting that you bring up that you mentioned those that have been in policing for a longer time versus the newer generation, the differences there. How do you encourage, I guess, mentorship in the space of policing, where you're learning from those that might have more experience versus those that might
Um,
not?
So it's interesting. I think that militaristic structure helps with that quite a bit because there's already a little bit of built-in mentors with your sergeants and your staff sergeants who've been on the job a lot longer. They've gotten to those ranks because they've been able to show their leadership skills. And so they do fall into natural mentorship roles, but certainly it's also built in throughout the organization. So right from recruit training, when you've first come out of recruit training, you're assigned to a PTO, a police training officer. So they act as your first mentor on the job, day to day on the street. Um, we do training programs for our newly promoted people, whether it's sergeants or civilians who've been promoted into supervisory roles. We have training courses for that. And part of those training courses are actually the ability for you to sign up for a mentor if you want. So there's certain people in the organization that volunteer to be mentors. And once you've completed that course, you can be matched with one of them. So it's that built-in mentor where, as a new supervisor, hey, this is happening. I'm not quite sure how to handle it. You can give that mentor a call. They can walk you through the processes and just help you gain your footing before you're really set off to run on your own.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And it's in a way, it's somebody self-selecting that they can become a mentor for another individual there. Do you find that when that is um, set up in that way, where it's somebody choosing themselves to be a mentor, is it a little bit more effective than?
Yeah, I think I think overall, my experience with EPS is it's a really positive organization. It's a very good place to work. People want to help each other. So certainly there are those more formal mentor relationships where, I volunteered and I was paired with someone and, we'd meet once a month and talk through things. But there's also a really good culture there. Like we've had a lot of people who have been with the organization decades. Our admin who retired last year was there over 45 years. So, and she'd been in admin her entire career there, but she was absolutely a mentor to, I think, just about everybody who knew her. Because if you didn't know the answer, you called Mark. Because if Mark didn't know the answer, she was the one to tell you who to contact. And I think there's a lot of those kind of champions throughout the organization that really act as those informal mentors to people. And your name gets known pretty quickly and gets passed around pretty quickly. So at least I find those people know everybody because people share their information. And so I think we're quite good at providing those mentorship opportunities formally, but also quite good at having those informal relationships.
That's phenomenal. And it makes sense that you would have both in place, right? So that you can encourage it both in the institution through, asking, hey, who would like to be a mentor? And also just like informally
Yeah.
as well, which adds, two layers to it. When it comes to, the police force and reporting incidents, there's, you know, all kinds of talk about the blue wall of silence, whatever that might be, right? I know that this also applies to construction industries as well, and other industries where an incident might occur and people don't want to speak up. and report about it because there might be, some backlash, whatever it might
Yeah.
be. How do you kind of go about encouraging a culture where it's okay to report an incident?
I will say, I think in the last 10 years, that there's been quite a significant shift in that with the organization. When I first started, we were on paper incident reports. And, you know, we didn't get nearly as many of them then as we do now. Now, of course, the organization is bigger. But, one of the most common things when we got an incident report that for a root cause, it would always be it was a dynamic situation. So, welcome to policing. Everything you do is a dynamic situation. That's not a root cause. But one of the first projects when I started with EPS is we were transitioning to an online safety incident reporting system. And I think that really helped change the culture around reporting. It was a lot of work and a lot of education, but giving them the online system and really hand-holding them through that incident reporting process, and more so the root cause analysis process, really helped them to understand why that was important. So I think previously when it was a paper report and it was a text box and you hand wrote whatever you wanted to put in there wasn't always the understanding of the concept of a root cause and why you were doing that. When we transitioned online, there's still a text box that they have to fill out, but we really categorized what they were giving us as root cause. So was it a substandard act? Was it a substandard condition? And so what we found was in the beginning, the first year or two, we had to do a lot of handholding and education with them. Because again, we were just speaking totally different languages. So for example, I can remember one of the first ones we did, we had a member who was driving and was rear-ended at a red light. So the guy coming up behind him was coming in too fast, didn't see the red light, rear-ended him. And so we talked about some of these categories, and so our consultant at the time was really pushing this was a substandard act, and it was failure to follow policy or procedure. And the supervisor completing the investigation was really adamant he can't put that down because in his head, that meant that his officer didn't follow policy or procedure. So they had a really hard time separating out the root cause from the person, and which makes sense. They're in policing. Their job is to find the bad guy who did something wrong. So when they're investigating something, they're looking for an individual. So it was a lot of training and education to get them to wrap their head around the fact that you're not looking at the individual, you're looking at the incident, what happened in the incident. And even if it was an individual who caused that, like the guy didn't hit the brakes, he rear-ended you, it's not him, it's the situation. And so switching to that online reporting really helped get that message across to them, I think.
Interesting. So it's shifting from blame to really just finding out what actually led up to that
Yeah.
particular situation, right? And also, you mentioned, when you were implementing that program, finding ways to make it stick so that, walking them through, kind of holding hands a little bit through that.
And we had to do a ton of that in the beginning. We have significantly less of it now. Obviously, there's always still a little bit of it with new supervisors that are promoted and just get it if they haven't had experience with it before. But because we have so many people that go up in a temporary acting position, they're TA in that role, they're doing the supervisory work, but they're being mentored by people around them. So we're getting less and less of that handholding that we have to do. But the also byproduct of finding or to them being able to understand that root cause analysis piece better is the corrective actions that we're getting are much more impactful. And because they're seeing the impact of those corrective actions, they're now far more likely to reach out to us in advance of doing other things. So if they're looking at doing equipment changes or process changes, when I first started, we might hear about it in the grapevine because you ran into someone in the hallway and they said, "Hey, we're doing this." Now we're getting that preemptive phone call of, "Hey, we're looking at doing this. What are all the things we need to consider?" So the overall safety culture has improved significantly in the last 10 years.
Huh. And it's not something that's easy to do, and it's not a one night overnight
No.
sort of thing. But it's something from what I can understand that's consistent. You kind of have to bring consistent effort to it, but seeing that turnaround can have a massive impact.
It's huge, and a lot of it is the ability of our section and the people, the amazing team that I have underneath me to be able to um, create that credibility within the organization so that we are a trusted resource and they know if they come to us, it's not a, it's, you brought up the hesitancy to report that can sometimes happen in any environment. Um, but I think when you have that credibility with the organization and they know that we're not looking at you as an individual, we're looking at the situation. And really, ultimately, all we care about is making sure it doesn't happen again. And once they get that understanding, it really shifts that hesitancy to report.
It makes complete sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
This episode is powered by BIS Safety Software, one of the leading safety and compliance software applications on the market today. With their assets module, you can track equipment, assign tasks, and attach inspection forms all from one centralized system. Schedule forms by time, mileage, or hours in use. Scan a QR code on site to access records instantly, even offline. From vehicles and tools to safety kits and sub-assets, it's never been easier to keep your inventory organized and your records up to date. See everything they have to offer at bissafety.ca.
So EPS earned a 100% score on its 2021 OHS audit plan.
Yeah.
What went into making that a success?
So every year when we do our audit, we always have an audit action plan that is our ways of trying to improve on what we've done previously. Certainly, it's a make work project, obviously, for our section because we're the ones tasked with this. But we look at ways to incorporate meaningful change across the organization. So when we do an external audit, in addition to our action plan that we do for the entire organization, we also look at doing mini plans with each of the individual bureaus to ensure that they are working on things that are specific to the issues that might have popped up during the audit. So it's really important that we're looking at not just policy and procedural changes that our group might be tasked with, but certainly larger scale changes that are impactful to areas across the organization. So looking at things like emergency response planning that, maybe changing how we do some of that, looking at updates to things like hazard assessments that we do on a regular basis, but maybe improving our processes to incorporating changes to hazard assessment following incidents or events or in the incorporation of new equipment and things like that. So it's really, the action plans are really crucial for us to have that focused idea of what we're really going to look at for the next year to make sure that we're continually improving.
And when you go about um, implementing these and then carrying them out, what are some of the ways that you make sure you're actually fulfilling that action plan?
So again, going back to that whole militaristic structure of the organization, one of the great things that our membership tends to be used to is the idea of diary dates. So everything that they do in policing is because it's so important, the work that they do in terms of accomplishing their goals on the policing side, they're very used to being tasked with things being assigned to them with a diary date. So when we go at looking at to implement action plans, that idea of assigning someone something and having a diary date that they've got to get it accomplished by is old news to them. They're very used to it. So it becomes very beneficial to us. We do more and more are trying to leverage our health and safety committees. So in 2018, when the legislation changed and we had to go from having one overarching committee to having a committee at every location, it really gave us an opportunity to develop some safety champions. And now that the legislation's changed again under the current government, and we don't require those committees anymore, we've chosen to stick with them rather than going back to one overarching committee because we were seeing such an improvement in some of the localized programming by having those safety champions at each site. So when we look at doing things like action plans or communication plans on pertinent topics, we really try and leverage those committees to accomplishing some of those goals.
Interesting. So And this kind of leads into my next question. So you've got committees in different departments, right? When it comes to scaling out successful pilot programs, so new safety initiatives, maybe brought on by, an audit plan or whatever it might be, how do you really handle resistance internally between the departments and also resource limits? Because you only got so many.
Yeah, and when you look at resource limits, I mean, certainly our section always feels that crunch too. We're a very, very productive group, but we're a very small group in terms of size of the organization. But when I first started with EPS, my manager was a man called Andy Simpson, who's since retired, and that's why I'm in the manager position. But he was probably one of the most influential people I've ever worked with. And one of the things he always pushed to us as his team was to focus on the people. And I genuinely find that if we can focus on the people, the resources come. The bulk of what drives our work is keeping our members safe. It's making sure that they're going home in the same condition that they came to work. So getting that message across and being able to articulate to leadership why we need to do what we're doing, the resources are given to us when we need it. It's, sometimes we have to scale a project. We might have to phase it over a year or two, depending on finances and things like that. But if you're ever a fan of Simon Sinek and he talks about focusing on the why, if we can focus on the why and how it associates to those people, we've never had an issue getting the resources that we need to accomplish the things that are going to be most impactful to our membership.
So it really just depends on the program making sense.
Yeah. And I think that's where, like, I have a lab and a research background. One of my team also comes from a lab environment. She was safety with AHS for a number of years. And prior to that, she worked in med lab. And so because of that history that we both have, we're very focused on the data. So we are not going to bring a proposal to our leadership that's like, hey, we saw this and it's kind of cool. We might want to try it. We're going to come to them with facts and data and statistics that verify why we want to do what we want to do. It's never just going to be a nice to have or an ask because we think it might be interesting. We're going to look to ensuring that we have the data to back up what we're saying. So if it comes to a new piece of equipment or a new pilot, or a new project, we'll do a pilot like we did with padded duty belts or like we did with external vests, so that we have the data in hand to show that upscaling that project is going to be beneficial to the organization. We recently launched a new clinic, a nurse practitioner clinic within the organization, just a couple months ago. And one of the roles of that clinic is part of her time is taking over doing our medical surveillance, but part of her time is also going to be made available for primary care services to our employees, both sworn and civilian. And one of the factors that drove that decision and got buy-in for that was us being able to provide the data showing how many Albertans are unable to find primary care services and how much more difficult that becomes for someone working a 24-hour shift cycle who may not have the availability to go see a doctor that somebody else does. So having that resource in-house that's available to them, and not just available, but understands their work and their role and the impact their jobs might have on their overall health. We were able to show the data of why that would be an important change for us and how that might improve overall outcomes for our membership, but also potentially cut costs for the organization as well.
Interesting. And it seems like with each one of these decisions, there's key data points.
Yeah.
At each step, some sort of research that you guys have done to at least back up and show, hey, just like with the duty belts,
100%.
This is the reasoning behind it. And that must come from that science background.
I think that plays a role in it for sure, and it certainly it certainly gave me and both my team that has that research experience, it gave us the ability and the skills to articulate it in a way that is able to be easily justified and being able to make a business case for it on more than just something that sounds like a good idea. We actually have the proof to back it out.
Right. Having that proof is critical. When you're a newer safety professional coming into the space and you're looking at, building some authority. It's not always easy, right? What are some actions that you can take to build influence with those you're working with fastest, and start shifting that culture if you see change that needs to be made?
I think one of the things that I see newer professionals do is second guess themselves. And I think if you're going to bring an idea forward, you better know that idea inside and out and be able to defend that idea. But you also need to be strong in your convictions. Um, as soon as someone sees someone being wishy-washy, it's going to lend the idea that you maybe don't know what you're talking about, even if you do. So I think it's really, really critical when you're going to bring any idea forward to an organization, especially when you're new and not well known, that you make sure that you have, again, the data to back it up, but you stay strong in your convictions. But you also have to come from it from a place of education and understanding the scenario. So how I would have approached things when I worked in labs and research is different than how I approach things with EPS. Certainly, there's not the ability to approach some of the issues that pop up with EPS the same way there is in a research environment. You don't always have the time and space, or it's just not logical. If I did a traditional hazard assessment at EPS, a patrol constable's hazard assessment would be 200 pages long, and no one in the organization would look at it. So years ago, we really transitioned how we present our hazard assessments to the membership because a traditional hazard assessment wasn't functional. So you have to have that ability to look at what's going to be functional and reasonable and useful. But when you've got that product, you have to back it up and you have to stay strong in your convictions.
Interesting. You can have the most, in a way, you can have the most detailed form or program in place, but if no one uses it,
It's absolutely useless.
what's the point?
And that was one of the things when I first started at EPS that Andy really made a point of driving home to me is that you can't look at it the way you would look at safety elsewhere because it's not. It's all well and good to check the box or rubber stamp a document to say that you have it, but if it's not functional or useful for the target audience, then it's not functional or useful for your program.
Right. And it makes complete sense. When, and we've talked a lot about the various improvements that you guys have made, and very clearly there's a great program in place. How do you keep that drive, that pressure for continuous improvement going, and I guess not getting complacent?
I think that there's so much change in policing technology and equipment and the hazards that we're faced with that it doesn't really afford us an opportunity to get complacent. Um, I think when you look at things like fentanyl and then the pandemic, which was like threw a wrench in everything our section did and totally took over our lives for the better part of a year. And then following that, leading into a lot of the protests that have been happening. So the constant changing nature of policing certainly keeps us from being complacent, but it's also actually looking at and evaluating your program. So, in our last audit, there's things that we scored really, really well on. There's a few things that we typically score higher in that we scored a little bit lower on. And I think that's a good thing. I want to have those objective evaluations and know where to focus our energy because yeah, we've done something really well for a long time and we stop focusing on that. And it's really easy to become complacent. So I think that audit process is really, really important to any organization, whether you have a core or whether you subscribe to ISO certifications or not. I think every organization needs to have some sort of audit processing that they're following just to give you that evaluation of what you're doing.
And making sure that what you're putting in place now makes sense, I guess,
Yeah.
now and for the future as well.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's things that we implemented, 10 years ago when we first started doing our online reporting that made sense then that we've transitioned away from because as our culture has improved, as our reporting processes have improved, that functionality was no longer serving us. So we've looked at changing how we do some of these things. And that's really important as an organization, is to making sure you're constantly evaluating yourself and changing to meet the times and meet the membership of your organization. Like we talked about earlier, how we approach some of these things with some of our newer, younger recruits is very different than how we might have approached it with a 20 or 25-year member. And the way we communicate with them has to be different. So as your organization changes, you need to make sure that you're changing with it.
This is a challenge that a lot of different industries are coming across now. There's almost, in some places, like 3-4 generations of people in the workplace.
100%. And even things like dress and deportment policies. Well, 10, 20 years ago, to look at a dress and deportment policy for the police and say that, long hair on men would never have been something that's considered, or earrings, jewelry, tattoos, things like that, where now you're really looking at, when you're making these policies, you can't differentiate by gender. You have to be inclusive. You have to look at impacts of religion and gender and all of these things, and make sure that the policies and the procedures and the equipment that you're offering takes those things into account. So it can be challenging to make sure that you're inclusive in all of those things. But again, like I said earlier, I think the more inclusive you are, the better it ends up being for everybody.
If you could give one piece of advice for newer safety professionals coming into this space. So imagine, Nicole, just starting out, you're starting your journey. What's one thing that you wish you would have been able to tell yourself?
I think when I first started, I was far too focused on the processes and the material things, like you got to have your policy, you got to have your hazard assessment. And I think all of those things are very important. But now, having, 15, 20 years in this space, and in safety, I think it's far more effective to have your primary focus start off on the people. So if you're getting resistance to a policy or a procedure or a piece of equipment, what's actually driving that resistance? And focusing on the people and making sure people feel heard, because I think that's huge. The number of situations we've had where, we've had to tell people no, or we've had to tell people, yes, you have to wear this piece of equipment that you don't want to wear, but making them feel heard as to why they're opposed to it or what the impact is going to be to them, I think moves mountains. And certainly there are people in EPS that I have told no to, or I've made them unhappy with something that we've had to do. But the way I've been able to do it and focusing on them and making sure that their concerns are heard has bought me credibility with that person, so that the next time something's going on, they're not hiding it from me. They're coming to safety directly. They're asking our input from the very beginning, so that they're involving us in that process, because we focused on them as people as opposed to just the process.
So important, and it makes complete sense. Nicole, I want to thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
This is phenomenal. Where can people find what you're up to, and the Edmonton Police as well? What's going on with them?
So EPS has our public website, EPS.net. I'm certainly available on LinkedIn. I have previously in the past done a few lectures for NATE for their OHS program, and have a number of newer OHS people who reach out to us. Certainly, we've also in the past had OHS students and things like that come and spend a day with our team to be able to kind of see OHS in a different light, because I call us safety unicorns, because we're not construction and we're not oil and gas, but we are OHS in Alberta, and that's kind of a rarity. So being able to have those conversations with people and kind of open people's eyes to a different type of safety in Alberta, I think is really important.
I love it. We'll include the links down below in the video here.
Perfect.
Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.